Welcome to the art and science of difficult conversations. I'm Chris.
And I'm Lucy, and we love having difficult conversations.
That's right. And each week we'll either share a tip, hear how others have gotten better at difficult conversations, or demonstrate common difficult conversations and what to do and what not to do.
Let's get into it.
Welcome to the art and science of difficult conversations, where we really truly believe when you communicate better, we can live better. I'm Chris, your host, and as always, I'm joined by Lucy. Lucy, how are you today?
Pretty good. I was sneezing a little bit right before this episode, but I'm ready. How are you
that's
doing
not allowed.
today?
That's not allowed during this podcast. Better stop that. I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Yeah, my daughter goes back to school tomorrow, so
Nice.
Finally a little bit of freedom, and as all parents feel, that freedom, that joy, the ability to kind of do whatever you want for 8 hours of the day, 6 hours.
So we'll be recording a lot of podcasts going on moving forward.
Yeah, we can record a lot more podcasts every day if we need to. Just record for the next 2 years. Well, Lucy, I'm excited about today's guest. I'm excited about today's topic.
Me too.
So for those of you that are in the States, if you're listening to this live, also, you can listen to it whenever, but we're in the middle of election season, as it always seems like every day is election season, more and more so. But we're in the middle of the actual election season for the president of the United States. And so with that comes a more and more polarizing and engaging, aggressive topic for people to discuss. It seems like people are just getting more and more angry. So we're really honored and humbled that we have a guest today that can really help us talk through, like, how are we going to have these conversations? Because boy, I struggle a little bit with these at times, other than just the active listening stuff. But how do I actually move it forward? That's not my forte. And I'm excited about this guest because, Lucy, I think I've only briefly mentioned it, but I used to do Kung Fu for many years. And at the Kung Fu school, this guy was actually my Kung Fu brother. We were in the same Kung Fu family together. So I'm happy to have you here, Chris Geggie. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here, and it's wonderful to see you, Chris. Lucy, it's wonderful to meet you. Longtime listener, first-time caller, and I'm really glad to be talking about, like, how do we have these difficult conversations around politics, particularly in, like, specially charged times like election season.
Yeah. So Geggie, can you tell us, just so everybody knows, we're going to call him Geggie just because two Chris's is very confusing, really.
I would be so confused.
But Geggie, tell us, kind of give us a brief history. How'd you get here? Who are you? How'd you get to where you're at?
Yeah, so my journey is a little convoluted, like a bunch of people. So I started my career as a teacher. I taught freshman and sophomore English. And then that was kind of one of my first forays into difficult conversations. How do you communicate with students? And then I bounced around the country a bit for different things after that, from grad school, where we met in Boston, to really the bulk of my work, which has been in politics itself. So for how many years was that? It seems like all of the years, but from 2013 to 2015, I worked in the marriage equality movement on campaigns in Rhode Island, New Jersey, Indiana, and then eventually became the statewide campaign manager for Ohio's campaign. And then after that, I worked briefly with the ACLU. And then after that, I worked at an organization where I recruited and coached teachers, current and former teachers, to run for elected office. And so kind of help them also navigate what could be difficult, even political conversations around public education and the issues that their communities faced. Now I work with Navy Federal Credit Union on their diversity, inclusion, and belonging team. And I get to coach a lot of wonderful people to think about how do we provide our best service, understanding that we might not have to agree on everything, but one thing that we do agree on is making sure that our members get the best service possible.
So you haven't really done anything, I would say.
Yeah, it's just a couple things, you know.
That's really impressive. You know, I'm interested, what drew you to politics and that realm?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. After my program, was kind of looking around at the different things that I liked doing, and it was by and large leadership development. And so I was trying to see, like, okay, so if I wanted to do this professionally, what needs to be true? And for the different jobs that I applied to, they kept on saying, wonderful grad degree, but it's not in the right area. So I was like, I've got to go back to school again. So I applied to a bunch of programs and then needed to find some kind of job to hold me over within that, or between the window of when I graduated and when the new program started. And I saw that Rhode Islanders United for Marriage was hiring paid canvassers. So this issue is extremely important to me. I like walking around. I kind of like talking to people. So I figured, this was a really good opportunity. Plus, it was a campaign, so it was going to be a short-term thing. And when I started, it was like something clicked in me, like being able to talk to people, hear their authentic stories, helping people share why the issue was so important to them, to the people that they love, to their community. And it was really in that moment that I saw, this is the real power of talking to people, of engaging in difficult conversations and bringing people together around shared values. So I said thanks, but no thanks to the other grad program. And then that's when I started to bounce around from Rhode Island to New Jersey, Indiana, Ohio, and so on.
That is pretty cool. And I can definitely resonate with bouncing around, bounce even across the ocean. And I also started my journey as a teacher. So we have more things in common, that's for sure, for high school students. And so, yeah, I, from teacher turned business owner to now coach. And I see that you have the curiosity and compassion and really go deeper in your conversations. And some people don't want to go deeper. Because it takes some patience also, and courage and openness. But what I'm hearing from what you shared, really bringing people together, discovering the values, that takes a lot of patience and openness and courage to have those conversations. So kudos to you.
Thank you. Yeah, it took a lot of practice because nobody is born with these skills. But I think that at the end of the day, when we're able to arrive at a mutual understanding that's based on shared values, that's truly how we build community and bring more people together.
Were you raised in an environment that talked about politics or these kind of socio-political issues?
Kind of. So my father is a police officer and my mom a nurse, and she got her sort of beginning in infectious wounds and trauma care. And so engaging in frank and authentic conversations around like the different issues happening, particularly in Los Angeles, particularly in the 80s and 90s, it was something that we couldn't really escape. And so I would say like one of the key things that I picked up from that is that we all individually have our own perspectives, even the same exact situation, but that's the only perspective we can ever have unless we're open to hearing how it's impacted other people. So I guess that's kind of one key takeaway. I wouldn't say we necessarily like actively engaged in like, what do you think about all of these different things? But it was still pretty commonplace to be like, hey, so the news is on, we're all listening to it. What resonates with you from that? And it's actually kind of funny too, as I'm thinking about it, how I started my political career as a paid canvasser. And actually one of my earliest memories is canvassing with my mom for, I forget which election, it must have been 92, Clinton 92. And it was like a get out the vote, like, hey, are you making sure that you're voting? And so she kind of brought me along. So it's kind of an interesting, fun memory. Yeah. I've got to call her up after this.
We're saying hi to her.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Just send her this episode. It's okay.
Yeah.
So from your experience, your vast experience. I mean, I'd love to be interested. Like, what makes these conversations so hard, especially in the workplace where there's sort of decorum about how we're supposed to treat each other already. But what makes it so hard to even talk about politics or share these differences?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so there are three big things that happen around political conversations that make them difficult. There's sort of the neurobiological processes that are happening. There's some psychological processes. And then, of course, there's just the social context within which these conversations happen. But it kind of boils down to like two big things. The sense of being included, like belonging to a group, the feeling of exclusion or being an outsider. And then I would say the feeling that we get when we think we have the right answer or the correct answer versus having the wrong answer. So like something that happens with our brains, like when so we just shared like all of our different connections with each other because it feels good to be a part of a group. In fact, that connection activates the reward centers of our brain. So like we're feeling that like good feeling. And whenever we feel the experience of exclusion, the same parts of our brain that process physical pain also light up when we feel exclusion. So it literally feels bad. It hurts to be excluded, right? So like on the social side, that's why we're more drawn towards similar groups, to people who have similar feelings, similar beliefs. And we don't like to feel like we're the outsider. Now, when it comes to like the idea of having the right or the wrong answer, it also feels good to have the right answer. Like think back to being in school when you knew you had that answer. It was just like, yes, I got it. Yes. And then when you get the wrong answer, it's like, oh, what happened there? How did I get the wrong answer? And kind of depending on the way that your viewpoints are, like how you frame the conversations, like growth versus fixed mindset, that can very much impact how you interact with other people. So that's sort of like one big on the one hand. So there are all of these processes taking place. And then, so when it comes to political identity, and here I'm just going to be very specific with the disclaimer, American political identity, which is also a very well-studied area. So, and I'm definitely not the spokesperson for all of that stuff, but what's kind of happened over, I would say, the last 40-ish years, but certainly well before then, I think, the way that political identity in America gets formed and centralized in conversations, I think is also something that to our detriment impacts the way that we engage in political conversations. And I'm using scare quotes there. So with the sort of formation of these identities, it's really more along the side of beliefs. So here, I think Adam Grant has a really good section on this. Like a belief is something that I think is true versus a values-based identity, which is something that I think is important. And so if our identities are really rooted in a belief, any kind of information that is contrary to that belief is perceived of as an attack. Like, I think that this is the absolute truth. So if I get any information contrary to that, I'm already going to be in attack mode or defense mode. And so what happens there is of course, we get our fight or flight instincts. So like we lose the ability of our prefrontal cortex to process some of these higher level thinking if it's already perceived of as an attack. Whereas if it's based in values, like what I think is important, then if we get different or contrasting information, it's not a matter of being right. It's understanding how to do what is right because of this new information. So again, when our identities are, particularly our political identities, are rooted in that belief that I think this is the truth, then we have that sort of social connection. I'm going to be in group with other people who think that this is true. We don't want to feel excluded from that group. So even if we might think something slightly different, or if we get information that might be contrary to the overall group consensus, we're going to fall into social conformity and discount our own beliefs in favor of the larger group. And again, kind of depending on the feeling of psychological safety within that group and our own experience with growth mindsets. So that's kind of why these conversations from the get-go can be extremely difficult. And then kind of on top of that too, what other contributing factors outside of our own brains that kind of make this a lot more difficult is just looking at how political discourse has changed over time, from person-to-person conversations to now we're on the internet behind message boards. We're more interested in scoring talking points or telling points than having in-depth conversations with other people.
Mm-hmm.
We also see that too with political punditry. It looks and feels so good for somebody on your side, whatever side that is, to ask the gotcha question, like, oh, got them, and because they got them, and because we share this identity, that feels good for me too. So it's sort of like activating these cycles of feeling the goodness, feeling the inclusion, and making us less prone to want to engage in much more deeper conversations, because again, we can fire off that message quickly and not necessarily have to engage.
So it sounds like that's the quick reward in a way.
Absolutely. It's the quick reward. And engaging in deep conversations around political differences, especially an electoral cycle, that's the productive ones generally aren't quick. But the reward, I would say, is deeper, is better.
It reminded me, like, the difference between, fast food that can be quick, satisfying at the moment, but then it has long-term negative consequences for us, and homemade prepared meal that may take longer to prepare. So if we have these more difficult conversations, but we take the time to really explore and focus on the quality of the conversation, go a little bit deeper, rather than of just having a quick reward, the consequences of that could be longer term, actually more well-being for all of us, sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially in the context of like, if and when these conversations take place at work, because they're happening already, kind of regardless.
Yeah.
It's impossible for us to compartmentalize like everything that happens outside of work with everything that happens, or from everything that happens inside of work.
You know what I think is interesting from what you said, Chris, is that there's so much tied into our identity, our values of who we think we are, what we believe in, and what we think is important to us. When I've seen these kind of conversations play out, whether it's an argument or even a healthy debate, it's always focused on, I want you to change your entire worldview to my worldview. And then there's other people that say, like, why don't we just agree to disagree? And then there are people that say, the opposite, like, we can't agree to disagree on human rights or things like that. How do you conceptualize a productive dialogue around politics?
Yeah. So I think that's a really important distinction to make, Chris. There's a very big difference between persuasion conversations and every single other kind of conversation. Conversations.
That's it. New word. That's it.
New word. We just coined it right here today. And there's some really fantastic research about like, how do you persuade somebody to change their mind, particularly over a charged issue. I think David Fleischer at the LGBTQ Center in Los Angeles has done a lot of really great research in things called deep canvassing. And then Hal Malchow, he recently passed away. He was a fantastic leader in looking at how to change people's minds through like mail programs. Like, can you even change people's minds through traditional forms of political persuasion? And all of the research says that it takes a lot of time and a lot of vulnerability and willingness on both parties to understand each other and really define like what are the shared values between or that we have, and how do those shared values then therefore relate to how we act and interact in a political space. And that's tough. And so like thinking about like workplace conversations, you're not going to persuade your coworkers to vote differently, like most probably, unless you have that relationship outside of work, and probably the majority of those conversations are already taking place outside of the workplace anyway. Yeah, I don't know. Did that answer your question? I kind of got on a couple of tangents.
So then, yeah, I think you're right. It's very hard to persuade people to do things. Like, you know, my background is a therapist, and there's a whole entire field of or approach motivational interviewing, which is just how to get people to want to change.
Yeah.
So then in the workplace, what do you think is like a more reasonable discussion or a way to have a discussion around politics and differences?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that unless your workplace is a political campaign, like there's a really high potential for political discussions to harm relationships or harm the kind of people that you're serving. So I think of it like from my work, like our members are our mission. And so like almost rule number one of just how we ethically interact with each other is we got to make sure that whatever happens between us does not negatively harm the people that we're serving. So to my mind, that's like centering around core values. But I would say the top four things to keep in mind around like having conversations about politics or elections in the workplace is understand that you're probably not going to win a debate against somebody else with their deeply held feelings and beliefs. So I would say like approach number one, take winning off of the table. Because once the conversation's not about me winning somebody, me showing that you have the wrong answer, again, activating that sort of negative experience, me excluding you from the conversation. Once that's out of the way, you can then just focus on understanding like, hey, Chris, I think that from what you're saying, we might have some different viewpoints here. I'd really love to understand more about how you've arrived at this conclusion, which is almost word for word what I would say in a work meeting. If somebody like came up with a different solution from the one that I like had in mind for an issue, like it's an opportunity to better understand somebody else's perspective. And so when you sort of approach it like that, you're taking out the assumptions and really leaving the space for that person to share if they're willing to share. So I guess that's number two. Or maybe that should be number one. Ask for consent to engage in these conversations. Like for some people, it's very difficult and it's deeply personal. And you know, we show up to work to do work. So I guess that could be really thinking about preserving the relationship that you have with that person. We're colleagues before election. We're going to be colleagues afterwards, and every single time in between, because elections happen every single year in the United States. We still will need to understand how to work with each other in a way that preserves dignity and respect, and our work product too. You know.
I love that. Sounds like being really intentional when we have these conversations. Not having as a win of I need to win in this conversation, but a win being it's still work environment, being productive, plus keeping that relationship and not making it impact those work relationships or even personal relationships we can talk about later. And also asking for consent and being curious and open. My question is, when somebody says something that is triggering and it goes against our values, and we feel that survival brain, that instinct to fight or flight, or other ones triggered, what would you recommend we do at that moment when somebody feels, you know, that anger come up and our brain kind of, the higher thinking brain shuts off? What to do at that moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So having that sort of situational awareness is very key, because like that's going to determine whether or not you can engage in a productive conversation. So thinking about like, how do we have productive disagreement? If I am activated by like what somebody has to say, so much so that it's just like, Chris Geggie, maybe Chris Wong, I need to stop and take a quick breath. Like that should be a great moment to signal to yourself, I need some self-care time. And I would probably use some, so it's the disarm method. So I'm going to disengage in the conversation. So I'm going to acknowledge refocus, and then moderate the conversation, ARM. So I probably say something like, Lucy, it sounds like you're really passionate about this. In the moment, I don't feel like I'm in the space to have this conversation. So maybe we can address this later. Can we focus on the task that we have at hand?
I love that. I would say it might, for some people, they might not be able to do that right away, because they might still
absolutely.
react.
and especially because, like, again, we have like this immediate instant gratification thing. Like we hear something, so we're used to being able to post something online very quickly to respond back to get those talking points. Whereas, at work, if we're preserving the relationship, like we might need to hold off. Now, what I will say too is we don't want people to like be in hostile work environments or to face harassment. So like if this is happening around you a lot, and you're uncomfortable with it, and you're not able to engage in a productive conversation with that person, like, hey, Lucy, that really landed on me, and I didn't really feel good when I heard you say that. What can we agree on right now to make sure that we're still able to maintain a respectful relationship? Like if you can have that, fantastic. If not, then just make sure that you're taking care of yourself, and maybe seeking out resources from like a supervisor or HR to help you intervene in that situation.
That's actually where I was going to ask next, based off of Lucy's question, because I think one of the things we often recommend to people is when they feel that microaggression, or just even outside of politics,
or it could be a macroaggression,
treatment, right? Micro, it's go back and give that feedback, tell people what impact it had on you, and give that feedback. I'm wondering, similar to that, I think there's oftentimes people will give that feedback and the other person just is not ready to receive it. They're like, stop being so sensitive. I'm just joking, or don't take it so seriously. You're not like them. Any of those variations, right? To kind of minimize the impact of what they said. How would you kind of navigate that?
And that's a wonderful question. Where do you think those reactions come from?
Well, I think that's the defensiveness, that fight or flight. So for me, it's thinking like they're in fight mode. They're ready to like just defend themselves to the ends of the earth there.
Yeah, absolutely. So like thinking about like the insider outsider kind of mechanism, when we say like another person's actions or words have negatively impacted us, that person is absolutely in defense mode. Like, well, I'm going to be leaning into, trying to minimize the impact of my actions. And you've really got to think about like, yeah, is this person ready and willing to receive the feedback in a way that is productive for them? And if not, I would probably pivot away from the conversation and try to see like, is there somebody else who can help me have this conversation with that person, or who this person might listen to better than me.
I think this is a great time because I'm actually working with a group right now of managers who they're finding that a lot of their staff aren't able to have the conversation with each other. They're actually coming to them to help kind of moderate or mediate those conversations. And they want their staff to have a little bit more capacity to manage those conversations between themselves. And like you, I agree. There's only a limit of how much you can do between yourselves. Like if one party's super entrenched, you're not going to make any progress. But when it becomes a culture, like the entire culture thing, what are you thinking about with like the leaders, how they're kind of helping to shape and nurture that environment?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is take it all the way back to what are our shared values? Like, what are the things that we believe to be important about our relationship with each other at work? Um, and then, based on those shared values, what does that mean for how we interact with each other to maintain a professional atmosphere? And that's some hard work. But I think
Mm-hmm.
really peeling all of the layers back and sticking to those shared core values, and then like reinforcing the conversation with that, like, hey, we might have a different viewpoint on this issue, but that doesn't mean that we still can't work together on a project. So actually, one of the people that I have worked with the longest, his name is Chris Nyers. Shout out to Chris Nyers, also another Chris. um,
It's a great name.
it's fantastic. So we've been working together in a volunteer capacity since 2007, and I tend to hold very liberal viewpoints, and Chris, opposite end of the spectrum. And it's also kind of funny. We're fraternity brothers, so we're also brothers, and we're able to still work with each other and engage with each other because we have that sort of set of shared values and that respect for each other and preserving the relationship. Like, we have had a lot of different arguments and debates on different policy issues, and we're still able to have frank and authentic conversations with each other about the shared work that we do. It's in risk prevention and crisis management for our fraternity. So like, our end goal is to make sure that we're able to provide this service to our undergraduates. And we do that by leaning into, again, the values that we have and what that means for how we interact with each other.
Mm-hmm.
It almost sounds like when we have this difficult conversation with somebody, not stay on the level of the different viewpoints and differences, but look somewhere deeper for something that we can share and agree on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess this is point number 3. We got to be able to be vulnerable with each other. If you're able to have these conversations in sort of like a growth mindset space where you're trying to understand somebody else's point of view, it might not change what you believe overall, but it still gives you better insight into that person and their experience of the same exact situation. Elections impact everybody differently, regardless of what happens in November. It's going to impact different people in different ways, right? That's just going to be the truth. And so, even with that in mind, like thinking about how are we going to approach maintaining relationships afterwards. So this is the advice that I would give to your managers. Like, already try to have like sort of like after action plan ready to go. Like, what are we going to do to make sure that things aren't going to get heated? How do we disarm situations? How do we provide our teams with the knowledge, skills, mindsets, behaviors to engage in respectful curiosity with each other? Like, if there's the space for that, how do we give them the tools to disengage from a conversation when it gets a little too heated, but still maintain that respect for each other? And then I think there's also like a sort of self-awareness piece too. How do we make sure that everybody understands, like, we're colleagues before the election, we're colleagues afterwards? Every single election is going to make somebody feel some kind of thing, whether positively or negatively. But at the end of the day, how are we still able to come together as a team and as a community?
When somebody is in that hijacked mode, or let's say they have a fixed mindset, but they are aware, they are open to change, what would you say could be something they could tell themselves to have that courage to open up, to be curious, to have that vulnerability?
I would say practice saying yet. So I don't know what Chris feels about this and maybe it's something different. I don't understand that yet, as opposed to I just don't understand, because then the conversation's over. When you're starting to introduce that yet thing, it's sort of like an action that you can take. Like, I might not understand what Lucy's experience is in Southern California yet. I don't understand your experience because we come from like different backgrounds, but that doesn't mean I still can't understand who you are and your perspectives of it. So like thinking about like political issues, I might not understand like what this whole side of the spectrum is doing with that, but I'm open to having the conversation. That's sort of what yet is. I'm open to learning about it. And that's sort of like thinking about a skill. Like, I'm not good at difficult conversations yet, right? And so if when we start to practice some of these things, then we can build that muscle. Now, if I'm being honest, if somebody is at the beginning of their journey around like growth mindsets versus fixed mindsets, and like that's just the reality with everybody, especially in political conversations. Like, we're all at different stages of our journeys. And for people who are at the beginning of those stages, trying to find like trustworthy resources to start some of that education yourself. So like, I might not understand much about the immigrant experience from the Czech Republic yet. However, I know that I can go look up some different resources, maybe some different accounts, biographies, just straight up history, to better understand where people are coming from with that experience and that background. So just even those simple steps of being open to like reading stuff, and then kind of taking it, you could take it a step further by then asking somebody and showing that respectful curiosity. Now, I also want to say we don't want to place a whole lot of undue burden or emotional labor on people from communities or backgrounds that are not yours. That's not really fair to them. And one person can't ever represent an entire community. It's just impossible. Again, because each and every one of us has our own very narrow sliver of perception.
I think that's so key, is that idea of building that awareness and understanding of somebody else's lived experience. There was a book, Big Data, where they just looked at all these research trends from Google. Are you familiar with the book?
I've seen it. I can't say that I've read it.
It was so interesting, and they found one of the things one of the research things that stood out to me was after there was like a terrorist attack during Obama's presidency, and he gave some sort of speech about how Muslims are not our enemy, they're firefighters and whatever. And they looked at Google Trends, and there was like, a huge number of searches about like, are Muslims terrorists and blah blah, all these like hateful search terms. A few months later, there was another terrorist attack, and this time he changed it to, Muslims are our neighbors, they're our friends, they're the people that we interact with on a daily basis. And they found that there was a lot less research for those same terms. And so I think it is that shared lived experience, or just understanding of somebody else's thing. I'd love to get your take on this, because when I used to do cultural humility trainings a lot more frequently, one of the things I would talk about is, it's not, if you're a person, if you're from a marginalized community, you're right, it's not your job to teach everybody else about your experience. And at the same time, somebody has to teach them. They have to learn somehow. Somebody has to share their experience so that other people can learn experience, even if you don't speak for everybody. So if you say it's not your job, you're right, it's not your job. It's somebody should do it.
So I want to touch on a couple of things that you said. Words shape our thoughts and therefore our actions. So if we think of a community as only X or only Y, then that's going to shape how we interact with them. So those two speeches are a really great example of just how powerful our words are when we're talking about other people and even ourselves and other people's experiences. So I like keeping that in mind, like, hey, again, colleagues before election, colleagues afterwards, somebody's going to be happy, somebody is not going to be happy with that election. So even thinking about how we share our own reactions in the workplace and with the people around us can have a profound impact on those people too. Again, because we don't like to be excluded, we don't like to feel that we're wrong, and even though we're taking like winning off of the table in our workplace conversation, somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose, and a lot of people are going to feel a lot of really deep feelings around that. So being careful with how we're shaping those conversations, and frankly, challenging people with how they are shaping the conversations with the words that they're using. We see a lot of divisive language, but the reality is, if you look at a standard distribution of people and just their political viewpoints, we all pretty much fit underneath the middle of that bell curve. So there's, in fact, more that unites us than divides us. Again, leaning into those shared values, like, okay, so we might not agree on the outcome of the election, but what can we agree on as neighbors, right? What can we agree on as people who carpool together at work? What are some of those things that we share between us that can help us just help us better interact with each other? And then, so that's all on the one hand. On the other hand, yeah, you're absolutely right, Chris. I have been in a number of situations where I am the only person with my backgrounds. I am Mexican American. I am a gay man. I'm from California who lived in the Midwest and then like all around New England. And now I'm in Maryland, like very, very different experiences from other people. And so, I'd say if you find yourself in that position and you're open and willing to share your story and experience, and it's not in a sort of exploitative way, like people are genuinely curious about that, like go right ahead, share your story and share that journey, because it's through that kind of storytelling and relationship building, again, preserving the relationship, that we're able to build those deeper connections and come a better understanding.
So we focused a lot on the workplace. I wonder if we could spend a few minutes on the challenging conversations in our personal lives. I know somebody that she just broke up with her boyfriend because they disagreed on the presidential election on whom, and had some personal strong opinions. And they realized, because they're on the opposite spectrum, that it's better to take a break from those. Anything that would be different when we, from the workplace, that's coming up for you? Any tips for people in those situations?
Yeah, that's a lot. So there's I forget who released this study. It was either Gartner or McLean and Company. And it said that for Americans, we are most likely to make friends at work than we are outside of the workplace. This includes like church activities, other things like that, just because of the amount of time that we spend with each other. So that's why, like, taking winning off the table and preserving the relationship at work is incredibly important, so you can preserve those relationships. So thinking about like our personal relationships, conversations with family members can be difficult because especially with like elders, because of just the way that social dynamics can work in families. So usually like folks like parents, uncles, aunts, grandparents, they're going to see you as like the little kid that they remember like bumping on their knee. And so like we can tend to revert back into those relationships or those, the framework of those relationships very easily if we haven't had an opportunity to engage and kind of like just renegotiate like who we are as adults together, and experiencing this world together. Not understanding or not being there as a fly on the wall for your friend's conversation. Like that can be a lot, especially because of just how divisive political discourse has been in our country. Like thinking about like shared values, I would hope that they had a shared values conversation to try to figure out like, so what are the things that are negotiable or non-negotiable for us in this relationship? And then I would also say, like, and this is the same thing for workplace relationships and conversations too, like understanding how to set and maintain boundaries too. Like, hey, Lucy, I appreciate that you're very passionate about this. I can see that this election is very important to you. I just don't like talking about this at work. I'd much rather focus on the project that we're working on. Can we shift the conversation over here? And then being able to maintain that boundary. Maybe I'd even say something like, hey, I really do appreciate our relationship and have like appreciated the wonderful things we've been able to accomplish up to this point. I don't want this area to negatively impact who we are and the things that we can accomplish together. It's a lot more difficult to do when it's your cousin, it's your sibling, it's your spouse or significant other. Hopefully with spouse, you've had these conversations before ahead of time, but some people haven't. And so, yeah, like in terms of like the personal relationship, trying to refocus around like, so what do we know is true about how, again, we want to interact with each other? Now, I've got several uncles who are very, very set in their political beliefs, and they're the kind of person that really want to talk or score the talking points. Like they'll say stuff to get a rise out of you, as opposed to engaging in a whole in like a discussion around like, hey, so that really did not land right with me for a number of different reasons. Can we talk about how we can have a better conversation on this topic? They're definitely not interested in that. So then it kind of comes to like, all right, so how do I want to respond to this situation? And what do I want to be true about how I approach this relationship with that person? Because then it sort of takes the ball back into your court to focus on things that are in your locus of control. So like, these are my mom's brothers. It's very important to me that my mom maintains the connections with them. So I know that in these circumstances, I can remove myself, even just briefly, to kind of preserve that relationship. There's no easy answer to any of this because it's just so complicated, especially when you get into familial dynamics. I mean, there's our political identities kind of things, and then like our identities within our families, and sometimes they can clash. And sometimes you've got to do the thing that helps you preserve yourself too, and just be able to disengage and try to maintain that relationship from afar, or completely disengage from that relationship. And I'd say if they're open to the conversation, like being able to set up some like a framework, some boundaries for this, like with my fraternity brother, we have a very psychologically safe relationship. We can be vulnerable with each other and ask these different questions because we know that it's coming from a good place. We truly are trying to understand each other. And it's not more of like a got you kind of relationship. And that's because we've been able to build things that way.
So what I'm hearing, even the growth mindset could be applicable here in those situations. Let's say you do have a fight with a family member or a dear friend outside of work. Maybe we haven't discovered a way how to talk about this yet.
Yeah,
all of us
absolutely.
are learning to have better
Absolutely.
conversations. So it doesn't mean that we will never have a good relationship ever after this fight. But we haven't just found a way to talk about this together yet, or something like that.
Absolutely. We haven't found a productive way to talk about this yet. So how can we do that? Of course, the other person you've got to be like, you have to want to engage with them. They have to want to engage back. And so sort of like opt in to like, so if we're going to concede that for certain things, you're not going to change my mind. Like as a gay man, I will not be convinced that I should not be able to marry my husband and have that marriage legally recognized. Like that's a non-starter for me. And I'm still willing to talk about like economic policy or other things like that. Like, so here are the areas that are non-starters for me, but that still doesn't mean we can't have a conversation around other LGBTQ issues, for instance. So like, and that was kind of commonplace in the marriage equality campaigns too. So I worked with a lot of people who are deeply religious, who are also deeply conservative, and figuring out a way like, okay, so we're not going to agree on certain things. And you know what? That's okay. It's okay. We don't have to agree on everything to be able to figure out how we can work together. And in particular, like to go on sort of like this journey together toward the freedom to marry. So there's this one mother, self-described Catholic Republican mother in Ohio. And it was actually her son who helped her along this journey. And so sharing those personal stories as a way to open up the conversation for better understanding. So she's a very devout Catholic. She doesn't want the government forcing any institution to, or any religious institution to recognize a same-sex marriage. But that doesn't mean a government shouldn't recognize her son's marriage. Like that was a thing for her. This is my faith, that's one thing, but I want my child to have those protections. And so like seeing how some of those values like come into action, that kind of helped her engage in deeper conversation and finding, all right, so what is that shared value? And then how can we arrive at a better place together?
I mean, that's really intricate discussion and conversation to have, to like even to create the psychologically safe space where you're willing to discuss it and be vulnerable, but then even to parse out like, hey, you might believe this and this might be true for this one domain and this might not be true in another domain. Like think about that gay marriage thing. So I'm just thinking like that must have taken a lot of conversation over time to create that space where you can talk about it and figure out how do we work,
Absolutely.
how do we come together.
And like that's why political conversations at work and like with your family members around election time, very different from political persuasion or persuasion of any kind. Like that was very deep work that was done by the mother, the deep conversations that her son was willing to engage with her on and that she was open to having as well. And that's why like when we are able to lean into better understanding, even if at the end of the day we don't agree on a policy or on an outcome, that doesn't mean we can't understand and respect each other.
Yeah.
And through that mutual understanding, through that mutual respect, grow to be stronger together.
Yeah, the good news is that's the tagline of our show. We communicate better, we can live better.
And we have the growth mindset, so it is teachable, it's learnable.
Absolutely.
There is hope for all of us.
I'm wondering,
one conversation at a time.
Yeah,
Yes.
one conversation at a time. I'm wondering, man, that'd be another good conversation. Religion, talking about differences in religion, and then religion and politics. I think that's a huge one too. Why don't we take a break? And I think if you're okay, I'd love to demonstrate or role play some of these things in the workplace and see how we could communicate better in them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to.
Hey, Chris here. I really appreciate you listening to this podcast. And if you are listening to this podcast because you're looking to get better at these difficult conversations, well, if you really want to de-escalate difficult behaviors and you want to be assertive without being aggressive and being true to yourself, I have a self-paced course that can really help you, because I know it's difficult being assertive in lots of different situations. If you're at work and you have to give feedback, if you have to deliver bad news to an employee, or deliver bad news to somebody that you care about in your personal life, or you're struggling to deal with defensive or sensitive people who are pushing your buttons and you don't know how to push back. It doesn't have to be that way. There is a world where you can handle these tough emotions with confidence. You can speak honestly and kindly while you're still being assertive. And you have the ability to manage emotional outbursts and stubbornness calmly, because these are things that I've had to overcome and learn. And so this self-paced course goes through all of those things. I've created this trust framework that helps you think through how to prepare for and how to facilitate hard conversations. And you hear a lot of it actually in this podcast as I talk about how to handle difficult conversations in lots of different scenarios. Currently, the course is closed for enrollment. There's a waiting list. If you are interested in learning more, enrollment will open up at the end of August and the beginning of September. So please go to the website. I'll link it down below, and you can learn more about it and join the waiting list if you want to hear more about it. But I'd love to see you there. And the other thing I noticed is whenever people that are like on either side, I've actually noticed both things, like the super extreme on either side, when they talk about it, they start getting super like visibly angry as they're talking. Like they're just talking and kind of ranting, and their mind goes tangentially, and they're like it suddenly reminds them of something else, and like they don't really care if you're on board or not. They're just kind of ranting as if they had no one else to talk to, and they're like, finally I have someone to share this with. And so that's what I always notice is like, wow, you're just angry. Like something's going on for you. You're just in a bad place that you can't even like talk about this with somebody.
And like that's another super fascinating thing. I wish I had more degrees and a research lab. So people that do have research labs, please do more research into this. So they're talking about this issue, whatever the issue is, and they're sort of like re-experiencing a moment for them. And like particularly if it's like a negative moment, it's like reliving that trauma. There we go, therapist Chris. And they're reliving that, they're re-traumatizing themselves and creating a negative feedback loop inside there. Now, given the context that it's in too, like that could also be activating the reward center of the brain as well. It feels good to get into this like angry space. And like when we're seeing this situation, because we've retrained our brains to react this way, our brains are like, oh my gosh, we're about to do the thing. Let's dive into that negative spiral.
The way you just said that, I think just triggered a memory in me. It's actually called a flashbulb memory. It's when the flood of cortisol hits your hippocampus during a really extreme event. That's why you can remember extreme events really clearly, like 9/11. For those of us that were around for it, we can remember what was happening because of that rush of cortisol into our hippocampus. So that's exactly what you're describing that I didn't think about or connect until this moment. It's very similar in that sense. I wasn't going to include that in the recording, but I guess I will now.
I think so.
We got to.
We have
my doggy, special guest.
So let's
buffet.
So let's talk, or let's demonstrate how this could feel in a work situation. I'm interested. So I don't know any scenarios you have in mind, but I think it'd be interesting. The scenario you were kind of hinting at before is like if we're in a team meeting and one of us were to say something really out of pocket, to quote the kids these days. So I'd love for you to demonstrate, Chris or Geggie, if you're up for it.
Oh, were you asking me? Yeah, I feel great about being the manager.
Yeah, great.
So
and Lucy, how do you feel?
Yeah.
Do you want to be the one that says really inappropriate things, or do you want me to say the inappropriate things?
Go for it today.
Okay.
I mean, sure, the one.
But let's still keep it work professional.
Yeah. And we could say this is towards the let's not bog them like everybody down with like too many details about the meeting, but let's just say this is a regular team catch-up meeting on like this is what we're doing the other week. It's not like anything special. Geggie, why don't you start us off, and then I'll wait like maybe one or two beats, and then I'll jump into something.
Yeah, absolutely. So welcome back, everybody. I hope that you have had wonderful weeks. I'm looking forward to checking in with just how all of our tasks are so we can mark them off of the task board. But to open us up, I'm just curious, what is everybody looking forward to most over this weekend? I know the election's coming up, so I'm hoping that y'all get some time to kind of relax and decompress.
Yeah, I'm not even trying to think about the election, actually. I'm just trying to relax and completely forget about that. Go somewhere camping, go to the nature.
Oh, good. I went camping for
wait.
the first time just a few months ago. It was really good.
Nice. Yeah, I love that. The night sky is gorgeous, especially in the desert.
Nice.
I recommend, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the election. I was just watching on the news, and that I just saw this news report that Biden is just putting all these migrants on airplanes in the middle of the night to just send them to different cities. And I thought that's just wild. Why is this quote unquote president getting away with all this stuff? This is nonsense.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That I can see that these issues are really important to you, Chris. And I think having a discussion about them is really important. And it's great that we're thinking critically about the kind of impact that some of these things could have. Yeah. As the manager right now in this moment, I'm realizing that I kind of messed up and asked people directly some questions around like the elections. And what I'd like to do, if we could, is kind of reframe the conversation. What could we do to make sure that we're still engaging with each other around our shared values? I honestly think I messed that up. Meta moment, because in real time, these are tough. And like, I don't think I addressed how that could have breached psychological safety, and how to come back to some of that psychological safety. So maybe how I would reframe that is, Chris, that's a really interesting news report that you've seen. I know from my own experience of just looking at the news reports and stuff, I kind of have some skepticism around like what's actually going on there. What I would love to do is just really kind of get back to our check-in question, like what are you looking forward to most this weekend?
Listen, Geggie, I respect you. Like we've worked together for a long time. Like I really like you as a manager. You're great. You don't have to apologize. Like I don't like you don't have to be weak about this stuff, right? Like we're all adults here. We've all worked together for a while. We know each other. Like we can talk about this stuff, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. I really do appreciate your saying that. I wouldn't necessarily phrase it as being weak in terms of the things. I just want to reground ourselves in some of our shared values of just being respectful with each other. I know that just from my experience as somebody who's Mexican American, that kind of reporting really did land on me differently, because of a number of different factors, from the things that are impacting the communities who are being planed in or not. I feel like I'm digging myself into a hole here.
Well, let's cut there. I think let's cut there. I think that's good. I didn't make it easy for you.
No, that's really good.
Stuff.
Wow, I'm writing that down on my notepad. Because here's the thing too, though. Like managers, like they're having to address these issues in real time, right?
Right.
Like,
Exactly.
so like, what are we doing? Like, we don't want to like put the stop on that and potentially like harm the relationship. Well, we do. Well, first of all, I think because we kind of opened up like sharing all of that stuff, like I just assumed like psychological safety. So maybe we could like go in and be like, hey, Chris, I think that is a little inappropriate for this space, because here's how this landed on me from my lived experience. What I'd like to do is like maybe hold that conversation off. Like it doesn't feel like it's going to be productive to our overall tasks today, which is making sure that we're checking the things off of our list and setting ourselves up for next week, right?
Yeah.
Versus
Mm-hmm.
like another situation where, you know, like you have to address the harms, I think, in an appropriate way. Like we don't want those breaches of psychological safety to remain, because that harms the team. It hurts the team. It creates that feeling of exclusion on our team members, and again, like that feeling that is physical pain.
Right.
So yeah, I think in that scenario, because it seems like we have like a good relationship, I would kind of like lean in and say like, hey, Chris, you know, maybe that sounds like a really fascinating article and viewpoint. Maybe we can talk about this after the meeting. I would really love to know what you're looking forward to this weekend, or something like that, to kind of pivot away from that. To kind of talk to you like in person, one-on-one. Like if it's more of like an egregious thing, like those Democrats, blah, 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 or something like that, where it's just like, it's really aggressive and assertive, that would be sort of like a different intervention as a manager, like definitely calling it in, like in that moment, like, hey, Chris, you know, that conversation or those comments weren't in line with our core values. What we're going to need to do right now is just stop and reframe and even reset this conversation. So what can we agree upon right now to make sure that we're still able to engage respectfully with each other? And then I think also too, Lucy, I just made an assumption that your feelings were sort of neutral about things. Like, let's say it was about all of those immigrants from the Czech Republic coming in, and we're flying them around on airplanes. Like that would be a different kind of intervention as well. I want to make sure that, like, as a manager, I'm caring for you as well. So I think it really does come down to how well do you know your team members? How well do you know about like how they're going to react to things, and sort of anticipating some of those responses, and ahead of time, like creating some of those boundaries. Like, all right, so here's what we know to be true. Like what we want to center is our relationships and being those colleagues before the election and after the election. So what are sort of the things that we can talk about and the things that maybe we should talk about like later outside of work or something along those lines? Because what we also want managers to be careful of is like not saying you can't talk about these things, because there could be like legal implications around what are they called, concerted efforts or conversations,
right
the National Labor Relations Board. So we want managers to be careful of that, and then understanding that, hey, so when something does come up, have a plan to intervene, and be able to talk with the team.
Yeah. I definitely threw you for a loop. Lucy, from your perspective, what do you think could have been done differently, I guess?
You know, one scenario comes up for me. And you're doing a wonderful job validating people's where they're coming from and kind of really having the empathy, wondering where they're coming from, what's their experience. Sometimes I wonder, just saying, Chris, it seems like it's really making you upset. And you know what? There are also a lot of things that make me upset. I totally get it. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm sorry you have this experience. Let's give words to somebody else. Let's say if it's a meeting, let's say frame it in one sentence what you're looking forward to in the meeting. So kind of creating already a framework for that and kind of a boundary around. So it's not going to be sharing for 10 minutes, but in 1-2 sentences max. What is it? Another way could be, I had a group when January 6th, things happening. We just had a meeting. They were focusing on building their businesses. And one person was really emotional, triggered. And she's like, "Can we? I cannot focus today. Like, can we talk about what's happening right now? Did you see the news? Like, I keep watching it since morning, and I'm really afraid." So I validated, it can be scary. It's these strange times, and bringing it back to like what is in our control that we can do right now. What are we here for? And looking at, yes, validating, yes, this is scary, this is upsetting, I get it. And right now, we cannot do anything about that. Or if you do have something you want to talk to somebody, go and take care of that. If not, if you can have that hour here, let's refocus. Let's refocus on something that we can actually change, that we can control. And that is how to be productive in this meeting. That was for their businesses, how you can grow your business. Then you can make more impact, let's say, in that specific meeting. So I wonder with bringing it back to what can we control? What are some of your wins? If that was frustrating, let's focus on some wins that we can bring in if that will be appropriate for that person. What's coming up for you as you hear this strategy, kind of bringing it to what we can control, bring it to the present and future?
I always think of it these kind of situations like, you everybody feels the energy in the room shift. And there's like, it's one of those like choose your own adventures where you can go a million different ways. And there's actually a lot of different ways that are correct to do this. It's not just one way. I've always encouraged managers to not say a lot. Like I do say apologize, take ownership of the situation, which I love that you did, Geggie. Like you were like, hey, listen, I apologize. I shouldn't have talked about this. This is my bad. I didn't mean to bring that up. We're supposed to be talking about this other thing. I don't know why I was even talking about that. And so I appreciate that. And I think it's just set that hard boundary of like, hey, I know this is a sensitive topic. I know this is important to you. So I'm happy to talk about this later, Chris. I'd love to make sure that we focus on what we're supposed to do here, and then we could talk about that afterwards. I tend to focus more on like, this is what we need to do now. Let's worry about this other thing later. I'll validate you later. I'll validate you now, but I'll acknowledge you now. And let's talk more later about like whether it was harmful, how harmful, being mindful of like, and then we can recontract in future conversations, like with the entire team. Like, hey, what do we need to do here? Because I messed up last time. We talked about politics. We're not really supposed to be like everybody has different feelings, and that's okay. Let's figure out how we can talk together about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what you said, Lucy, about like acknowledging what's happening. So like when we acknowledge like, hey, Chris, it sounds like you're really like upset about all of this happening. Like that acknowledgement doesn't necessarily have to be agreement. And in fact, acknowledging that somebody else is feeling something, it's validating that, hey, somebody with a different perspective than I do is having something that is also a valid reaction to this experience. Yeah, that was great.
Yeah. So I think it'd be interesting. Why don't we role play the next part of this is where, let's say we had this meeting, you were able to get me back on track, and you just wanted to catch up with me after the meeting real fast to just touch base. It's not an official one-to-one or a coaching session, but you just wanted to check in with me because you're like, what's happening here?
Yeah, absolutely. So Chris, thank you for taking the time to meet with me to talk about this. I just want to level set right now. I want to understand before I seek to be interested. And I just really want to make sure that we're grounding this conversation about like what happened in our check-in meeting in our relationship. So from the get-go, I want you to know that an outcome for me is understanding where you're coming from so that I can better support you in the work that you're doing, because I can tell that this is an issue that's really important to you, that the things that are happening in this electoral cycle are having an impact in one way or another. And so I just love to know what's going on, and then how we can figure out how to best support you, and also figure out how we can best do our work together as a team.
Yeah. I mean, listen, Geggie, I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm not trying to get you in trouble. I don't want to get you in trouble by having these kind of, if I'm not supposed to talk about it, I'm not supposed to talk about it. I just know that you've always tried to create this open environment, and so like I want to talk about the stuff that's important to me. this is important, right? This is our country. This is the stuff that's going on around us. Do we want to have our country get better or get worse, right? We kind of have to make that decision as a country, and so that's why it's important to, vote and be active and do all that stuff come election time.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think engaging in the process, like that's one of our country's core values, is making sure that we're engaging with each other and making to the best of our abilities, like the decision that we think is right. And that's not necessarily going to be the same thing for everybody. And so, what I challenge you to do is to think about how other people in the conversation might be impacted by the different stories, the different things that we bring up in conversation. So I know I opened the door. I talked about the election, and in that moment, I know for me, I wasn't thinking about how everybody feels about elections. I love elections, so I'm really excited about that. But we don't know how other people are going to react to the election. And so for me, I know what I'm going to do is just try to be a little bit more conscious about how I enter the space around elections, and then also like think about how to make sure again that we're still grounded in our core values of dignity and respect for everybody.
Yeah, that's fair. I think I'm on the board with you. Like I think it's important
Yeah.
after I read, a lot of Nelson Mandela's work. I think he was spot on in like making sure people were engaged and really, politics are important. So um I just thought it was important to discuss, we should be talking about it out loud, right? Um but if you don't want me to talk about it, I guess I also won't talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is, let's try to figure out a way to bring that passion into the work that we're doing, like to make sure that we're able to finish all of our tasks, all of our deliverables, so that we're providing the best service that we can, and then figure out a way that maybe as a team we could engage in a community service action together, so that we're still grounded in our core values of dignity and respect for each other, and then maybe putting that energy around the election into something that supports the community around us.
Sure, sure. Is that it?
Great. Yeah.
All right, we can cut there. Great, great. So let's debrief that. Lucy,
Yeah.
how do you think that went?
So what I am noticing, I think also I need to give kudos to Geggie for staying emotionally calm, especially after being called weak previously in the conversation.
Yeah, yeah.
So for any manager who would be called weak, I think that could be a very triggering moment. So kudos to you. That's already something powerful in my eyes, really being able to self-regulate and staying calm. And in
Yeah.
the following conversation, I would say that also the tone was calm, non-aggressive from both sides. And even Chris said, yeah, you know what, if you want, I'm not gonna. So it showed like respecting the boundaries in a way of the meeting and being open. So I think that went well. Of course, that could be closing off. I'm not gonna talk about it, never.
Could be. Yeah.
But it seemed in that context, yes, I'll respect that boundary of the meeting. Let's focus on work. It could be one of the interpretations. So in that way, it went well. And what you're doing incredibly well is really being focused on the psychological safety of people, feeling heard, validated, and creating that opening for them if they really want to express themselves further. There are some way. Let's talk about that. So you're not closing that option. No, for sure, we're not going to be talking about that. But you're creating some boundary. And at the same time, there's an opening if that's needed for that person. Yes, we can take it to the next step if you need. But here is a boundary and here is the flexibility part. So kind of yes ending. And finding also a thing that you could connect on and align on, looking at the values. Yes, this is important. So both of you, in a way, found a place that you could both agree on and build on the top of that. So wonderful. Chris, how was that for you as the
Yeah,
experience from
I
your
do
side?
appreciate how calm you were. I didn't know if me calling you weak would come back to me at some point. I what I find interesting is like your approach is similar to how we often tell people to navigate difficult conversations in general. What I noticed was that you guided the conversation a little bit more than I typically do. You guided it towards the shared values, whereas stay very open and stay super curious about like what is going on for you, what's important for you in the situation, and I wait for them to say some sort of value before I. But you are guiding me towards that. But that's more in line with kind of why these are hard conversations in general. You want me to focus immediately on like what do we share in terms of values and beliefs. And so and I appreciate that you shared about what you're gonna do as well. I think that was nice, so that it wasn't just like you got to change. You're a fool. Get your act together. Yeah, the only thing I would have added was just being more explicit about what outcome you're looking for from me. But not the how to get there, but what is the goal that you need? Like how can we get to a place where you feel like you can speak your mind and that we're holding back from certain conversations in group settings. Like I think I personally that's my approach is just like being more explicit about what you're expecting out of me, especially in a manager employee
Yeah.
relationship, being that concrete. Like I also need you to stop saying that in group settings. Unless we all agree in a group setting, we want to talk about this in detail and learn about our own beliefs. But yeah, that's the only thing I would have added to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely, or there can be like a place and a time for those conversations if you're very explicit about like how it's all set up. So yeah, like maybe if at like a team retreat, like we're having more of like a get to know you kind of deeper conversation setting, like that's fantastic. But Chris, it's our Friday meeting. Everybody wants to go into the weekend happy. Right?
Yeah.
It's funny because I normally would have more of an open-ended question approach in sort of some of those exploration conversations, because I like to better understand that, I think. And this is probably me going into a safety bias with an election happening and just how divisive it is. Like I really did want to hone in on like the specific shared values. Like these are the things that we are agreeing upon, like as the foundation of our relationship with each other. How do we make sure that we're maintaining that and getting back to it?
These are hard situations in general. And, there's no easy way out of them. I think there's lots of ways they can go right or at least okay. And there's lots of ways they can go wrong. It's like multiverse here. You can infinite realities. And so it's really about I think in Lucy and I talk about this as the main point of our conversation our podcast is at the end of the day, it's how do we create deeper and better relationships with the people we're working with around us or personal lives and still meet the goals we're trying to get at. How do we get both the outcome we're looking for and the relationships that we're looking for?
Yeah, and I think a good part of that too is recognizing that we're going to make mistakes. I mean, I know I made a few mistakes over the course of the conversation, and like I think being able to admit to that, to the people, like, hey, I didn't handle this as well as I could have because these are really
Yeah.
difficult. So, but what I want to do is make sure that we're still able to do our best work together, Chris and Lucy.
So, Chris, as we come to the end of our podcast, what do you and Lucy, like, what are 1 to 2 takeaways you think that people could take if they really like skip the entire episode, and just popped in these last 15 minutes? What's 1 to 2 things that they should take away?
Because we don't have a lot of practice with these conversations, because for a number of different reasons, because of how difficult political identity is in general, like we're going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
It's going to happen. And so like, how do we hit the reset button and come back from that? And I think
Right.
that is just as equally important a thing to remember as is like all of the sort of guidelines, not guidelines, but all those sort of things that we've been talking about today, like for engaging in the conversations. It's assuming that we're going to have really positive relationships. We're going to have really positive interactions, that the person across from us is open to growth, is open to maintaining psychological safety, and everything happens wonderfully. And I hope it does for everybody listening. And sometimes we're going to mess it up, and that's okay. What is not okay is just leaving the mistake there and not learning from it yourself as an opportunity to grow, to practice that growth mindset, but then also to make sure that if there was any like harm done to the psychological safety of the team, that we're able to repair it in a meaningful way.
I would bring it back maybe to the growth mindset, that it is a journey.
Yeah.
It's not a fixed. We are all learning to have these difficult conversations. That's why they're difficult. It's not easy to get them right. And I'm also hearing, in a way, being self-compassionate to ourselves rather than judging ourselves when we mess up, when we feel that went horribly, that conversation, be it from the side of a manager or being from the side of a team member that could be judging. Oh my God, Chris is bringing that up. Oh, he called him weak. Oh God. So I could be internally suffering also there. Could be really, whenever we notice getting triggered, that's part of the emotional intelligence, being able to also, when we are judging ourselves, we're judging the other, give first compassion to ourselves. This is stuff I'm not feeling comfortable right now. Or also to the other one, wow, how they're probably feeling. They're feeling upset. That sucks. Yeah, all of us get upset. And really having understanding, curiosity, both for ourselves and the other, rather than from the judgment. And remember that as one of the steps. No matter where in the journey, that all of us mess up, and it's okay.
Yeah. Geggie, Lucy, I agree with both of those comments. I think those are great. You know what I think is interesting that I had never thought of is also the fact that it's okay to not talk about politics at work. It's okay to actually set a boundary of we're not going to talk about this because that's not the purpose of what we're doing here, which I think is weird for some people because I think they think there's a way to facilitate all types of conversations and you should be able to bring your full self to work. And you should be able to bring most of your full self to work. And at the same time, you are there to work. You're there for another purpose altogether. So I appreciate that. And I think that's probably going to be helpful for some managers to think about. It's like, okay, I can set a boundary. We're not going to talk about politics or this kind of stuff at work. We can save it for after work if need be, but we're not talking about it here because that's not what we're getting paid to do here. Yagi, thank you so much. We really appreciate your sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us. You dropped a lot of knowledge bombs on us. If people are like, I need to talk to this guy, I need to learn more, I need to have him work with us or consult with us or even just give us some advice, how can people reach you or follow you?
Yeah, that is a great question. Thank you for having me so much. This is a wonderful conversation. I can be found on LinkedIn as Chris Geggie, and there's only a few of us on there.
We will find you and we'll put the link into the notes.
Or just connect with everybody. Connect with all of them. There's not many of them.
Network. Have the conversations.
Lucy, any final thoughts before we sign off for today?
Just gratitude. Thank you, Geggie, for joining us and showing also lots of courage with the role play where you didn't know what was coming. It takes courage and vulnerability. So thank you so much for modeling for all of us how just sometimes we don't have to know how it's going to go. Just it takes really the courage and vulnerability to show up for those difficult conversations, be it a role play or real ones. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you both for having me.
Hey, we appreciate everybody listening. If you are interested in connecting with him, we're going to put his LinkedIn link in the show notes. We'll get information about him. But we would love to hear your thoughts. Please like, subscribe, give us a review. Let us know what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think everything he said was right? Do you think everything he said was wrong, and you think that we're all wrong about talking about everything here? Let us know. Talk to us. Subscribe, and we'll talk to you next week.